The morning ritual. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 4:30 as Clara wiped flour from her hands, surveying the golden loaves cooling on wooden racks throughout whispered wheat bakery. Steam still rose from the freshly baked bread, carrying the warm, yeasty aroma that had filled this corner shop for 3 generations. She'd inherited the bakery from her Aunt Rosemary just 8 months ago, along with the faded recipe cards written in careful cursive and the responsibility of keeping a neighborhood tradition alive. Clara pushed a strand of chestnut hair from her forehead, leaving another dusting of flour across her cheek. The pre-dawn hours were her favorite, when the city still slept and she could lose herself in the meditative rhythm of kneading dough, shaping loaves, and coaxing life from simple ingredients. Her hands moved with practiced grace, arranging the morning's offerings. Crusty baguettes, pillowy dinner rolls, and her specialty sourdough that had taken her months to perfect. At exactly 6 o'clock, she flipped the hand-painted sign from close to open and unlocked the heavy wooden door. The morning air carried the scent of her baking into the street, where early commuters hurried past with purposeful strides and steaming coffee cups. Clara had learned to recognize the regulars. Mrs. Patterson, who bought 2 blueberry muffins every Tuesday, the jogger who grabbed a whole wheat roll on Saturdays, and the construction workers who cleaned out her Danish pastries by 7:15. But it was the man in the charcoal suit who intrigued her most. He appeared every morning, at 6:05, as reliable as sunrise itself. Tall and lean with dark hair that caught the early light, he moved with quiet confidence through her door. His clothes spoke of success: tailored jackets, polished shoes, silk ties in muted tones, yet he carried himself without arrogance. There was something almost careful about his manner, as if he were stepping into a world where his usual rules didn't apply. "Good morning," he would say in a voice that reminded Clara of warm honey. "1 sourdough loaf, please." Always the same order. Always delivered with that gentle smile that reached his eyes and made something flutter in Clara's chest. She'd wrap his bread in brown paper, their fingers sometimes brushing during the exchange, and he'd thank her with genuine warmth before disappearing into the stream of morning commuters. Clara found herself watching for him through the window, her pulse quickening when his familiar silhouette appeared at the corner. She'd started timing her morning routine to ensure the sourdough was perfectly cooled by 6:05, though she told herself it was simply good business practice. "You're here early again," she mentioned one Thursday morning as she selected his usual loaf. "I like the quiet," he replied, his gaze sweeping over the cozy interior with its exposed brick walls and hanging dried herbs. "It's peaceful here, like stepping into another world." Clara smiled, understanding completely. The bakery existed in its own pocket of time, unhurried and genuine in a city that rarely paused to breathe. She'd noticed how his shoulders seemed to relax the moment he crossed her threshold, how his formal demeanor softened as he inhaled the bread-scented air. As he left that morning, Clara realized she didn't even know his name. Yet somehow, this stranger had become the anchor point of her day, the familiar face that made her morning ritual complete. She found herself wondering about his life beyond those 5 minutes they shared, about what drew him to her small corner of the world when the city offered endless alternatives. Tomorrow, she decided she would ask his name. The silent observer Marcus Thorne adjusted his Italian leather briefcase and checked his Rolex as he stepped out of his penthouse elevator into the marble lobby. 6:45 a.m., right on schedule for another day of boardroom meetings, architectural consultations, and the endless demands of running Thorne and Associates, the city's most prestigious design firm. His driver waited outside with the black sedan, engine purring, ready to whisk him toward another day of million-dollar decisions and corporate power plays. But Marcus turned left instead of right, his polished Oxfords clicking against the sidewalk. as he walked the 8 blocks that had become his sacred ritual. His assistant Emma thought he'd developed a sudden passion for morning exercise. His business partner David assumed it was some new networking strategy. Neither suspected the truth that the most successful architect under 40 in the city had become utterly captivated by a flour-dusted baker who probably earned in a year what he spent on wine. The irony wasn't lost on him. Marcus lived in a world of glass towers and steel frameworks, where every line was calculated and every surface gleamed with cold perfection. His penthouse apartment, featured in Architectural Digest just last month, was a masterpiece of minimalist design, all clean angles, neutral tones, and carefully curated emptiness. Beautiful, perhaps, but as soulless as the corporate contracts that funded it. Then there was Whispered Wheat Bakery. The first time he'd stumbled across it had been purely accidental. A delayed subway train had forced him to walk to an important meeting, and the aroma of fresh bread had stopped him mid-stride like an invisible hand. Through the window, he'd glimpsed a young woman with gentle eyes and flour in her hair, pulling golden loaves from an ancient brick oven with the reverence of someone performing a sacred ritual. Something in his chest had shifted. A recognition he couldn't name. Marcus had bought a sourdough loaf that day, telling himself it was merely curiosity. But when he'd torn off a piece that evening in his sterile kitchen, the bread had tasted like home, not the cold mansion where he'd grown up, but some idealized version of home that existed only in his imagination. Warm, honest, made with hands. Instead of machines, he'd returned the next morning, and the next, drawn by something far more complex than bread. Clara, he'd learned her name by listening to customers, moved through her small domain with an unconscious grace that fascinated him. She knew every regular by sight, remembered their preferences, asked about their families with genuine interest. Watching her work was like witnessing alchemy. Simple ingredients transformed into something that brought joy to people's mornings. Marcus found himself memorizing details about her, the way she hummed softly while arranging pastries, how she always tucked that rebellious strand of hair behind her ear with the back of her wrist to avoid getting flour on her face, the genuine smile that bloomed whenever children pressed their noses against her display case. She existed in vivid color, while his world had somehow faded to corporate grayscale. Another early morning? His driver Michael had asked yesterday, noticing Marcus's walking routine. Just enjoying the fresh air, Marcus had replied, but the truth was more complicated. Those few minutes in Clara's bakery had become the most authentic part of his day. Everything else, the power lunches, the client presentations, the charity galas where he smiled and networked and played the role of successful bachelor, felt like performance art. Clara never treated him differently than any other customer, despite his expensive clothes and obvious wealth. She wrapped his bread with the same care she showed everyone, spoke to him with the same gentle warmth. In her presence, he wasn't Marcus Thorne, architectural prodigy and corporate heavyweight. He was simply a man who appreciated good bread and kind eyes. The dangerous part was how badly he wanted to be more than just another customer. He'd caught himself lingering, asking unnecessary questions about her day, her dreams for the bakery. She always answered with patience and grace, but Marcus sensed the careful boundary she maintained, professional friendliness without the invitation for something deeper. Smart woman. She probably saw right through him, recognized him as another wealthy man seeking entertainment among the common folk. The thought stung more than it should have, mainly because it held enough truth to wound. But as Marcus turned the final corner, toward Whispered Wheat Bakery, breathing in the familiar aroma that signaled sanctuary, he allowed himself to hope that maybe Clara saw something in him worth preserving, something real beneath the expensive veneer, something worth coming back for every single morning. The unspoken connection. 3 weeks had passed since Clara learned his name was Marcus, and somehow that small revelation had shifted everything. What began as polite customer service had evolved into something neither of them quite dared to name. A gentle dance of morning conversations that stretched longer each day, filled with careful questions and shared smiles that lingered just a moment too long. "The sourdough's particularly good today," Clara said, as she selected his usual loaf, though they both knew she said something similar every morning. It had become part of their ritual, like actors following a beloved script. "I'm sure it is," Marcus replied, accepting the brown paper package with hands that seemed reluctant to leave the counter. "You put so much care into everything you make. It shows." Clara felt that familiar warmth spread through her chest, the same feeling that had been growing stronger with each passing day. She'd begun to notice things about Marcus that had nothing to do with his expensive suits or obvious success. The way he held doors open for elderly customers, how his voice softened when he spoke to children, the genuine interest in his eyes when she mentioned her plans for expanding the bakery's morning pastry selection. "My aunt used to say that bread holds the baker's intentions," Clara found herself sharing. "Happy thoughts make lighter loaves, worried thoughts make dense ones. Sounds silly, but I've found it surprisingly true." "Then your bread must be made of pure joy," Marcus said quietly, and something in his tone made Clara look up sharply. Their eyes met across the narrow counter, and for a moment the busy morning world outside seemed to fade into silence. A customer's entrance broke the spell, and both Clara and Marcus stepped back slightly, color rising in their cheeks like teenagers, caught stealing glances in study hall. As the days stretched into weeks, their conversations grew bolder, more personal. Marcus began arriving a few minutes earlier, when the bakery was empty except for Clara's quiet presence and the lingering warmth from the ovens. She started saving him the best loaf from each batch, though she'd never admit it aloud. "Do you ever miss it?" Clara asked, one misty Tuesday morning, surprising herself with the question. "Having someone to bake for at home, I mean." "Breakfast. Together, sharing the first cup of coffee." Marcus paused in the act of reaching for his wallet, considering her words with unexpected seriousness. "I think I've been missing something I never actually had," he said finally. "My apartment is impressive, I suppose, but it's not a home. Not like this place." Clara's heart did something complicated in her chest. She'd been wondering about his life outside these brief morning encounters, imagining some sophisticated woman in his gleaming world of success and expensive dinners. The loneliness in his voice surprised her, made her want to reach across the counter and offer some small comfort. "Home isn't about the building," she said softly. "It's about the feeling when you walk through the door. Whether someone's waiting, who's genuinely happy to see you. Is that what this is?" Marcus asked, and Clara realized they'd crossed some invisible line they'd been approaching for weeks. "You being genuinely happy to see me?" The question hung between them, like morning mist, delicate and transformative. Clara felt her cheeks warm as she met his gaze directly. "Yes," she said simply. "I look forward to seeing you every morning. I worry when you're late, wonder about your day after you leave." Marcus's smile was different then, not the polite customer service smile she was used to, but something raw and grateful and achingly real. "I rearrange my entire schedule around these 5 minutes with you," he confessed. "My assistant thinks I've lost my mind, walking 8 blocks when I have a perfectly good driver waiting outside." "8 blocks?" Clara laughed, surprised. "Where do you work?" "The Meridian Tower," Marcus said, then seemed to catch himself, as if he'd revealed more than intended. "It's downtown." Clara knew the Meridian Tower. Everyone in the city did. It was one of those gleaming architectural marvels that scraped the sky, home to law firms and investment companies and the kind of businesses that dealt in numbers too large for ordinary comprehension. The walk from there to her little bakery really was considerable, especially in expensive shoes. That's quite a detour for bread, she said carefully. Yes, Marcus agreed, his eyes never leaving her face. It is. The admission settled between them like a promise, unspoken but understood. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a door opening to possibilities she'd been afraid to consider. This man in his perfect suits, who smelled like expensive cologne and moved through her world like a visitor from another planet, was choosing her small corner of ordinary magic over whatever waited in his tower of glass and steel. Same time. Tomorrow? Marcus asked, though they both knew it wasn't really a question anymore. I'll have your sourdough ready, Clara promised, and they both smiled at the beautiful lie they'd been telling themselves for weeks, that this was still just about bread. The unexpected gesture. Clara arrived at Whispered Wheat Bakery at 4:15 Thursday morning to find her worst nightmare waiting in the darkness. The ancient brick oven, which had faithfully served 3 generations of bakers, stood cold and silent. No matter how many times she checked the gas lines, adjusted the pilot light, or whispered desperate prayers to her late Aunt Rosemary, nothing happened. The oven that was the heart of her bakery had simply died. By 5:30, Clara sat on her flour-dusted apron in the middle of the empty bakery, surrounded by unbaked dough that would soon be worthless. Her emergency fund barely covered rent and utilities, certainly not the cost of repairing or replacing an oven that was probably older than she was. The weight of potentially losing everything her aunt had built pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. She'd called every repair service in the city, but the earliest anyone could come was Monday. 4 days of lost revenue, disappointed customers, and mounting bills she couldn't afford to ignore. Clara pressed her palms against her eyes, trying not to cry over the cooling lumps of sourdough starter that represented hours of careful nurturing. 6 o'clock sharp, she heard the familiar sound of the front door's bell, followed by Marcus's distinctive footsteps. Clara quickly wiped her eyes and stood, forcing a smile as she faced the man who had become the bright spot in every morning. "I'm sorry," she said before he could speak. "The oven's broken. I don't have any fresh bread today. I should have put a sign up, but I kept hoping." Marcus took in the scene immediately. Clara's red-rimmed eyes, the unlit display cases, the defeated slump of her usually straight shoulders. His expression shifted from polite customer interest to something much more personal and immediate. "What do you need?" he asked simply. A miracle mostly, Clara attempted to joke, but her voice cracked slightly. "Or about $15,000 for a new oven, whichever's easier to come by." Marcus nodded thoughtfully as if she'd asked him to pick up milk instead of suggesting an impossible sum. "Let me make some calls." Marcus, "No," Clara said quickly. "I wasn't asking for... I couldn't possibly accept..." "You're not accepting anything yet," he said gently. "I'm just making calls." He pulled out his phone and stepped toward the window, speaking in low, authoritative tones that Clara couldn't quite catch. She watched his reflection in the glass, noting how his entire posture had changed from their usual morning chat to something commanding and efficient. This was clearly Marcus in his professional element, and for the first time, Clara caught a glimpse of the power he wielded in whatever world existed beyond her bakery's walls. 20 minutes later, Marcus ended his final call and turned back to Clara with an expression she couldn't read. "There's a commercial bakery supply truck coming at 2 o'clock this afternoon," he said casually, as if arranging emergency oven deliveries was perfectly normal. "They'll install everything and have you operational by tomorrow morning." Clara stared at him, her mouth slightly open. "That's impossible. Those things take weeks to order, and the cost..." "It's handled," Marcus said simply. "I can't let you pay for this," Clara said, her voice stronger now despite the way her heart was hammering. "I don't even know what you do for work, but I can't accept charity from a customer, even one I've grown fond of." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made Clara's cheeks warm. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm an architect. I design buildings like the Meridian Tower, where my firm is located. I have more money than I know what to do with, and I've been coming here every morning for 2 months, not because I need bread, but because 5 minutes with you is the only genuine part of my day." Clara felt the world shift slightly around her, pieces clicking into place. Marcus Thorne. She'd seen his name in the newspaper's business section, attached to photos of groundbreaking ceremonies and architectural awards. He was someone important, someone who moved in circles far removed from her small corner bakery. "The bread was never what brought you here," she said quietly, understanding flooding through her. "No," Marcus admitted. "It wasn't." Clara looked at this man, really looked at him, seeing past the expensive clothes to something vulnerable and honest underneath. He'd been walking 8 blocks every morning, rearranging his schedule, making himself part of her world because he wanted to be near her. And now he was offering to save her bakery without expecting anything in return. "Why?" she whispered. Marcus stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, smell his cologne mixed with the lingering aroma of flour that seemed to cling to everything in her domain. "Because this place, because you remind me that there's still magic in ordinary things. Because your smile is worth more than every building I've ever designed. Because I've been pretending for weeks that I just wanted sourdough when what I really wanted was the chance to be part of something real." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes again, but these were different from the despairing ones she'd shed over her broken oven. These were tears of recognition, of possibility, of something beautiful unfurling between them in the quiet morning. "Light, Marcus," she began, but he shook his head gently. "Let me do this for you," he said, "not as charity, but as someone who cares about what you've built here, who cares about you." The truth. Unveiled at 4:30 the next morning, Clara stepped into Whispered Wheat Bakery to find the familiar warmth of her new oven already heating the space. The installation team had worked until nearly midnight, replacing not just the broken oven, but upgrading the entire baking station with equipment so advanced it looked like something from a culinary magazine. Yet somehow they'd managed to preserve the bakery's rustic charm, integrating the modern elements seamlessly into Aunt Rosemary's carefully crafted atmosphere. Clara ran her hands over the pristine surfaces, marveling at how Marcus had understood exactly what she needed, without making her feel small or dependent. This wasn't charity. It was partnership, though they hadn't yet defined what that partnership might become. She mixed her sourdough starter with practiced movements, but her heart wasn't entirely focused on the familiar rhythm of kneading and shaping. Today felt different, charged with possibility and the weight of yesterday's revelations. Marcus Thorne, accomplished architect, wealthy businessman, and apparently a man who'd been falling in love with her one morning conversation at a time. The grandfather clock chimed 6 as Clara arranged the morning's first batch of perfect loaves in the display case. At 6:05 exactly, Marcus appeared at her door, but instead of his usual tailored suit, he wore dark jeans and a simple sweater that made him look younger, more approachable. In his hands was a paper bag that smelled distinctly like coffee. "I brought breakfast," he said, holding up the bag with a tentative smile. "Real coffee from the place down the street, and some of those Danish pastries you mentioned wanting to try making. Thought maybe we could eat together, since you saved my morning routine and all." Clara felt her heart do something complicated and wonderful. "We're having breakfast together?" "If you'd like," Marcus said, suddenly looking uncertain. "I realize I've been quite forward with the oven and the confession and everything. If you'd prefer to keep things as they were." "Marcus," Clara interrupted gently, "what do you want this to be?" The question hung in the air between them, honest and direct. in a way that bypassed all their careful dancing around the truth. Marcus set the coffee bag on the counter and looked at her with an expression so vulnerable it made Clara's breath catch. "I want mornings with you that don't end at 6:10, he said quietly. "I want to know what makes you laugh, what you dream about at night, whether you like old movies or terrible reality television. I want to bring you coffee and listen to you talk about sourdough starters and your plans for the bakery. I want to be someone you're genuinely happy to see, not just as a customer, but as someone who belongs in your world." Clara stepped closer to him, reaching across the counter to touch his hand. His fingers were warm and steady beneath hers, real and present in a way that made everything else seem suddenly clear. "I've been looking forward to 6:05 for weeks," she admitted. "Not just because you bought bread, but because you listened when I talked. Because you made me feel interesting, worth knowing. Because somewhere between the polite small talk and yesterday's grand gesture, I started falling for the man who walked 8 blocks just to spend 5 minutes in my company." Marcus turned his hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. "So where does that leave us?" Clara smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Well, you could start by staying for that breakfast you brought. And maybe tomorrow you could come a little earlier, help me with the morning prep. I could teach you to braid challah bread. I should warn you, I'm better with blueprints than bread dough," Marcus said, his relief evident in the way his shoulders relaxed. "That's all right," Clara replied, moving around the counter to stand beside him instead of across from him. "I'm better with yeast than building codes. We'll figure it out together." As they unpacked the coffee and pastries, settling into the comfortable rhythm of sharing breakfast in the quiet bakery, Clara marveled at how perfectly Marcus fit into her morning sanctuary. He asked thoughtful questions about her baking process, listened intently to her stories about difficult customers and successful experiments, and made her laugh with his own tales of architectural disasters and demanding clients. "So what happens now?" Clara asked as the morning light grew stronger outside her windows. "Do you go back to your tower of glass and steel, and I stay in my flour-dusted kingdom?" Marcus considered this, watching her face as he spoke. "What if I worked from here sometimes? I have a laptop and most of my meetings are phone calls anyway. I could sit at that little table by the window, drink your coffee, and watch you work your magic with bread and customers." "You'd really want to do that?" "Clara," Marcus said, reaching for her hand again. "I've spent 2 months rearranging my entire schedule around 5 minutes with you. I think I can manage to rearrange it around 5 hours. Clara leaned closer, breathing in the scent of coffee and Marcus's cologne and the yeasty warmth of fresh bread that would always be part of her world. "I'd like that," she whispered. "Good," Marcus murmured, and when he kissed her softly in the golden morning light of Whispered Wheat Bakery, Clara tasted the promise of countless mornings yet to come. Outside, the city began to wake up, but inside, the bakery, surrounded by the fruits of Clara's labor and the warmth of unexpected love, time moved at its own perfect pace.